June 21, 1941, Moscow. Joseph Stalin sat in his Kremlin office reviewing the latest shipment manifests. Another trainload of grain had crossed into German territory that afternoon. Rubber, oil, manganese ore. The deliveries continued as they had for nearly 2 years, ever since he and Hitler had signed their pact. Stalin lit his pipe, satisfied. The Germans were getting everything they needed. The arrangement was working perfectly. 1,200 miles to the west, along the entire length of the Soviet border, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, over 3 million German soldiers lay hidden in forests, behind hills, in staging areas just beyond sight of Soviet border posts. Thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of artillery pieces, thousands of aircraft, the largest invasion force ever assembled in human history, coiled and ready to strike. And in Moscow, Stalin was reviewing grain shipments. The warnings had been coming for months, from everywhere, from everyone. Richard Sorge, Stalin's master spy in Tokyo, had sent over 80 separate intelligence reports. Exact dates, exact numbers of divisions, exact invasion plans. Stalin had written across one report in red pencil, "You can send your source from the aviation headquarters of the German General Staff to his mother. He's not a source, but a disinformator." Churchill had sent warnings through British intelligence. Stalin dismissed them as provocations, attempts to drive a wedge between him and Hitler. The British were desperate, he reasoned. They wanted the Soviets and Germans to destroy each other. Soviet border commanders sent increasingly frantic reports. German reconnaissance planes violated airspace daily, massive troop concentrations visible across the border, artillery being positioned. Stalin ordered them to stop panicking. He forbade any aggressive response that might provoke the Germans. The final warning. On the night of June 21st, a German sergeant named Alfred Liskow deserted his unit, crossed the border, and surrendered to Soviet guards. He told them the invasion would begin at dawn. 3:15 in the morning, he said, the entire German army. Tomorrow. The report reached Moscow. Stalin's response. The deserter is probably a provocateur sent by German generals who want to create a conflict. Stalin went to bed that night confident in his analysis. Yes, there were tensions with Germany. Yes, Hitler might make demands. Perhaps he wanted more territory, more resources. But Hitler was a rational actor. He was still fighting Britain. He wouldn't be foolish enough to open a second front. The pact would hold. It had to hold. Stalin had built his entire strategy around it. 3:15 a.m., Operation Barbarossa. At 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, the German artillery opened fire. Along an 1,800-mile front, thousands of guns fired simultaneously. The sound could be heard 50 miles away. The ground shook. The sky lit up with orange flashes that turned night into flickering day. For 30 minutes, the bombardment continued. Then the guns fell silent, and 3 million men began to move forward. German bombers struck 66 Soviet airfields in the first hours. Soviet aircraft, neatly lined up wing to wing on the ground as if for parade, were destroyed where they sat. Pilots ran from barracks to find their planes already burning. By noon, the Soviet Air Force in the western districts had effectively ceased to exist. 1,200 aircraft destroyed, most without ever leaving the ground. The phone call. The phone in Stalin's Kremlin apartment rang at 4 a.m. Defense Commissar Semyon Timoshenko and Chief of Staff Georgy Zhukov were on the line. The Germans had crossed the border. Multiple reports. Artillery bombardment. Ground forces advancing. Airstrikes hitting cities. This was not a provocation. This was war. Stalin's first words, "Are you sure this is not a provocation by some German generals?" Zhukov, trying to keep his voice steady, repeated the reports. The scale, the scope, the entire border was under attack. Cities were being bombed. This was the invasion. Stalin said nothing for several seconds. Then, "Think it over." He hung up. Denial for the next hour, as German tanks rolled deeper into Soviet territory, as Soviet units were overrun, as communications broke down and chaos spread. Stalin tried to reach the German embassy. He wanted to speak with Ambassador von der Schulenburg. Surely there had been a mistake. Surely Hitler didn't know. This must be unauthorized action by Wehrmacht generals. The embassy didn't answer. The ambassador was already on his way to the Kremlin with a message, but not the kind Stalin hoped for. At 5:30 a.m., von der Schulenburg was ushered in to see Molotov, Stalin's foreign minister. The ambassador, looking uncomfortable, read from a prepared statement. Germany was acting in self-defense against Soviet preparations for attack. The Reich could no longer tolerate the threat. A state of war now existed. Molotov listened, his face expressionless. When the ambassador finished, Molotov spoke quietly. "Do you believe that we deserve this?" The ambassador had no answer. Stalin arrived at his Kremlin office at 5:45 a.m. His inner circle was already there. Molotov, Beria, Malenkov, Timoshenko, Zhukov. They stood when he entered. Stalin walked to his desk, sat down, and stared at the maps being spread before him. Red arrows showing German penetrations. Already the arrows were deep. "What are our orders?" Timoshenko asked. Stalin seemed unable to focus. He kept returning to the same questions. Was this really Hitler's decision? Could it be a provocation? Should they avoid full-scale response in case this was a misunderstanding? Zhukov, barely controlling his frustration, explained again. The scale of the attack made it clear this was planned. This was the invasion they'd been warned about. The invasion Stalin had refused to believe was coming. Stalin finally issued orders. Soviet forces were to defend themselves and counterattack where possible. But the language was cautious, almost tentative, as if he still couldn't quite accept what was happening. Catastrophe. By mid-morning, the situation was catastrophic. German forces had penetrated 10, 20, 30 miles in some sectors. Soviet communications were collapsing. Units were being encircled. The carefully planned defense lines existed only on paper. In reality, chaos. And Stalin, the dictator who controlled every aspect of Soviet life, who had purged and terrorized his way to absolute power, seemed paralyzed. Molotov speaks. At noon, the Soviet people finally heard official word of the invasion, but not from Stalin. Molotov gave the radio address. His voice, usually so cold and bureaucratic, carried an edge of emotion. Today, at 4 o'clock in the morning, without any declaration of war and without any claims being made on the Soviet Union, German troops attacked our country. He detailed the border violations, the bombing of cities, the unprovoked aggression. Then came the line that would echo through Soviet history. Our cause is just. The enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours. But where was Stalin? The Soviet people waited to hear from their leader, the man who had shaped their nation for over a decade, who demanded absolute loyalty, who presented himself as the father of the Soviet state. Where was he now when the nation needed to hear his voice? Stalin remained silent. The breaking point. In his office, he continued to receive reports, each worse than the last. The Germans were advancing on multiple fronts. Minsk was threatened. The Baltic states were being overrun. The southwestern front was in chaos. The Luftwaffe owned the skies. Soviet casualties were mounting into the tens of thousands. Stalin's responses became increasingly erratic. He issued orders, then countermanded them. He demanded counterattacks, then forbade aggressive action. He called commanders, berated them for retreating, then seemed unable to give clear direction. Those around him watched with growing concern. This was not the Stalin they knew. The decisive, ruthless leader had been replaced by someone who seemed lost, almost bewildered. June 28th. The collapse. On June 28th, 6 days into the invasion, the situation reached a breaking point. Minsk had fallen. The Western Front was collapsing. German panzer groups were racing toward Smolensk. The scale of the disaster was becoming clear. This wasn't just a setback. This was potential catastrophe. Stalin visited the Defense Commissariat that afternoon. He found chaos. Contradictory orders, no clear picture of where Soviet forces even were, communications with entire armies lost. He exploded at the commanders, blamed them for the disaster, and then seemed to deflate. He left the building, got in his car, and gave an order that shocked his security detail. "Take me to the dacha." He went home, and he stayed there. 2 days of silence. For 2 days, Stalin remained at his dacha outside Moscow. He didn't go to the Kremlin. He didn't chair Politburo meetings. He took few phone calls. The Soviet Union was fighting for its survival, and its leader had withdrawn. What happened during those 2 days remained somewhat mysterious. Stalin himself never spoke of it in detail, but people who saw him described a man in the grip of deep depression. He paced. He slept little. He seemed, in the words of one observer, crushed. According to Nikita Khrushchev, who heard the account from others who were there, Stalin said to those around him, "Lenin founded our state, and we fucked it up." It was an extraordinary admission. Stalin, who never acknowledged error, who had built a cult of personality around his infallibility, was confronting the possibility that his miscalculation had doomed the Soviet Union. The reckoning. He had ignored every warning. He had trusted Hitler. He had left the Red Army unprepared. He had purged the officer corps of its most experienced commanders. He had delivered resources to Germany right up until the invasion. And now German forces were racing toward Moscow, and there seemed little that could stop them. June 30th. The delegation. On June 30th, a delegation from the Politburo arrived at the dacha. Molotov, Beria, Malenkov, and others. They found Stalin in his study. When he saw them enter, his face showed fear. He thought they had come to arrest him, to blame him for the disaster, to remove him from power. "Why have you come?" he asked. Molotov explained they needed him. The country needed him. They proposed forming a state defense committee with Stalin at its head, complete authority over the war effort. But he had to return. He had to lead. Stalin looked at them for a long moment. Then he agreed. July 3rd. Stalin speaks. The next days were spent preparing. Stalin would address the nation, but it had to be done right. The speech had to acknowledge the crisis while rallying the people. It had to be honest about the danger while projecting confidence in ultimate victory. On July 3rd, 1941, 11 days after the invasion began. Stalin finally spoke to the Soviet people. His voice came over the radio at 6:45 in the evening. Millions gathered around receivers in apartments, factories, collective farms, military units. They had waited nearly 2 weeks to hear from their leader. Now, finally, he was speaking. Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, men of our Army and Navy, I am addressing you, my friends. The opening was unprecedented. Stalin never used such informal, warm language. Brothers and sisters, my friends, this wasn't the distant godlike figure of propaganda. This was a man speaking to his people in their darkest hour. He acknowledged the gravity of the situation. The enemy had captured Lithuania, Latvia, much of Belarusia. They threatened Ukraine. Soviet forces had retreated. The danger was real. But then he began to build the case for resistance. He reminded them of Napoleon's invasion, of how Russia had survived that catastrophe. He explained that Hitler's armies, despite their initial successes, were not invincible. They could be beaten. They would be beaten. The strategy, he outlined the strategy. Partisan warfare behind German lines, scorched earth, leave nothing for the enemy, burn crops, destroy infrastructure, make every mile of occupied territory a nightmare for the invaders. In case of forced retreat, he said, all rolling stock must be evacuated. The enemy must not be left a single engine, a single railway car, not a single pound of grain or a gallon of fuel. All valuable property, including metals, grain, and fuel that cannot be withdrawn, must be destroyed. He called for factories to shift to war production, civilians to dig anti-tank ditches, build fortifications, every able-bodied person to contribute to the defense, the great patriotic war. And he framed the war in terms that would resonate. This wasn't just about communism or the Soviet system. This was about the survival of the Russian people, of all Soviet peoples. This was the great patriotic war, echoing the patriotic war against Napoleon. The issue is whether the peoples of the Soviet Union shall remain free or fall into slavery, he said. The Soviet people must realize this and abandon all complacency. The response. The speech lasted about 20 minutes. When it ended, there was silence across the Soviet Union as people absorbed what they had heard. Then, gradually, a shift began. The panic and confusion of the previous 11 days began to crystallize into something else. Determination, anger, a will to resist. Stalin had finally found his voice. But it was different from before. The cult of personality remained, but something had changed. He had spoken to the people almost as equals. He had acknowledged danger rather than pretending invincibility. He had made it personal, brothers and sisters. Those words mattered. They suggested shared struggle, shared sacrifice. Not a distant leader commanding from above, but someone in the fight alongside them. The transformation. In the days and weeks that followed, Stalin's transformation continued. He took direct control of the war effort through the State Defense Committee. He met with commanders daily, sometimes hourly. He made decisions, often brutal ones. He ordered the defense of cities. To the last man, he authorized blocking detachments to shoot retreating soldiers. He demanded counterattacks, even when the cost was horrific. The paralysis of late June was gone. Whether it was genuine recovery or simply Stalin forcing himself to function, he became the wartime leader the Soviet Union needed. Ruthless, demanding, unforgiving of failure, but present and engaged. The memory. But he never forgot those first days, never forgot the warnings he'd ignored, never forgot how close he'd come to complete disaster. In private conversations later in the war, he would sometimes reference the invasion. "They deceived me," he said once to Averell Harriman, the American ambassador. But it wasn't quite accurate. He had deceived himself. He had wanted to believe the pact would hold. He had convinced himself that Hitler was rational, that Germany wouldn't risk a two-front war, that the warnings were British provocations. He had built an entire worldview around these assumptions, and when reality shattered them, he had briefly shattered as well. The cost of that miscalculation was staggering. In the first 3 weeks, over 400,000 men killed or captured, thousands of tanks and aircraft, destroyed entire armies, encircled and destroyed territory containing millions occupied. By December 1941, when the German advance finally stalled before Moscow, Soviet casualties numbered in the millions. The occupied territories contained over 60 million people. The industrial heartland of Ukraine was lost. Leningrad was under siege. The Soviet Union survived, but barely. And only because the Russian winter arrived, German logistics collapsed, Hitler made his own strategic blunders. The Soviet people fought with desperate courage. It didn't have to be so close, but it didn't have to be so close. If Stalin had heeded the warnings, if he had allowed the Red Army to prepare, if he hadn't purged the officer corps, if he had positioned forces properly, if he had accepted reality instead of his wishful analysis. Those 11 days of silence spoke volumes. The man who demanded absolute control, who never admitted error, had been confronted with the consequences of his greatest mistake. And for 11 days, he couldn't face his people. Brothers and sisters, when he finally did speak, he used words he'd never used before. Brothers and sisters, my friends, words that acknowledged shared humanity, shared peril, shared responsibility. It was the closest Stalin ever came to an apology, not in the words themselves, but in the tone, in the admission, implicit but clear, that the situation was dire because leadership had failed, that trust had been misplaced, that the Soviet people were now paying for decisions made in the Kremlin. "Our cause is just, our cause is just," Molotov had said on June 22nd. "The enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours." It would take 4 more years, 27 million Soviet dead, cities destroyed, populations devastated, a generation scarred. But Molotov's words proved true. The enemy was defeated. Victory came. June 22nd, 1941. But on June 22nd, 1941, as Stalin sat in his office trying to understand how his careful calculations had gone so catastrophically wrong, victory seemed almost impossible. The pact he had trusted lay in ruins. The army he had purged was collapsing. The warnings he had dismissed had been accurate, and the nation he ruled absolutely was looking to him for leadership. For 11 days, he had no words. When he finally found them, they were different words than anyone expected. Not the propaganda of invincibility, not the distant pronouncements of a dictator, but a direct appeal, almost intimate, acknowledging danger and demanding sacrifice. The revelation, brothers and sisters. In those 3 words, Stalin revealed more than any amount of analysis could show. The man who had never seen himself as anyone's brother, who had murdered his way to power, who trusted no one and demanded absolute obedience, was asking his people to stand with him, not because he commanded it, but because survival required it. The invasion had shattered more than military plans. It had shattered Stalin's confidence in his own judgment. And in that moment of shattering, briefly, he had spoken to his people as a man rather than a god. It wouldn't last. It wouldn't last. Within months, the cult of personality would reassert itself. Stalin would again become the distant, terrifying figure who ruled through fear. The propaganda would portray him as the genius who had always known, always planned, always controlled. But those who heard that July 3rd broadcast never quite forgot it. The tone, the words, the sense that just for a moment, the man behind the myth had been visible. What did Stalin say? What did Stalin say when Hitler broke their pact and invaded Russia? For 11 days, he said nothing. And in that silence, the Soviet Union nearly died. When he finally spoke, he said, "Brothers and sisters." And in those words, he asked his people to save him from the consequences of his own catastrophic mistake. They did, at a cost almost impossible to comprehend, but they did. Conclusion. If this story of denial, paralysis, and ultimate transformation has moved you, subscribe to Frontline America, World War II, right now. Hit that like button and share this with anyone who wants to understand the human cost of strategic miscalculation. Drop a comment. Could Stalin have prevented the catastrophe if he'd heeded the warnings? And where in the world are you watching from? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.